going on, everyone? Sorry, I'm on the live stream here. I'm gonna fix my hair a little bit. Summertime, we don't have to be too properly coiffed. What does coiffed mean? Is that like a French word or something? I'm not even sure. Anyway, Kevin Cole here. Unexpected points. Now, if you thought last week I got kind of lucky with some topics coming up that I could live stream and talk about, in addition to your questions. So anyone on here, let me go ahead and put it in here. I'll put drop Q&A here. In addition to your questions, which are good. I have the ability recently through this Twitter thing of finding people's articles that they're sharing the most. That helps me identify some stuff that I can talk about. And then also the Q&A helps me. And then this week I had another interesting kind of combining two of those things, which is there's an article from Arif Hassan, friend of the show. I think I've had him on here before. For those of you who don't know Arif, I believe it's just Arif Hassan, at Arif Hassan. Oh, NFL. He's got the dreaded NFL at the end. RIP Arif on that one. That was something that I couldn't do myself. Is there another Arif Hassan out there? That reminds me of my proposal for Elon. Elon, if you're tuning in, I'm not sure. You don't project as much of an NFL football fan. Clearly, you're a nerd. Likely on the spectrum nerd, Elon Musk here. But I doubt you're listening to this program. But if you are, we need a proposal here whereby even if you have to confirm, maybe through government ID, I'm fine with doing that, your legal name. And once you have a certain ratio of followers over someone who has your Twitter handle of your name, you should be allowed to basically just take it from them. Maybe some very light monetary compensation, like the Kevin Coles of the world or Kevin _Cole, whichever one I want to take here. Those people of the world who logged in back in 2012 or whenever this godforsaken platform of Twitter was developed, took the username and then tweeted out two things 17 years ago and haven't done anything since. Give me that handle. So I don't have to have this. I mean, my triple underscore at the end of Kevin Cole is probably even worse than the Arif Hassan, the NFL at the end. Okay, that was a tangent. As you know, I'm good for some tangents on this show. So tangent rant/rant is done on that front. But back to Arif. So he wrote an article, and he actually shot me a DM and some other nerds that he spoke with about quarterback clutchness. How do we measure it? What do we think about it? How does the media talk about it? What are my opinions on it? So that's good. I like that. I think I need to actually find a way where I don't have to generate my own ideas and have any sort of, initiative or work ethic in that sort of way. And instead, I can just field some things and then come up with some analysis, which helps from you guys when you give me some Q&A that I can look into. But I'm going to walk you through how I thought about that question, even though it might seem a little silly to the grand scheme of things and anti-nerd in a way to think about whether a quarterback is clutch or not. And it probably is something that is leaned into way, way, way too hard, even if there is any truth in the matter. I still figure it's interesting to think of how can we measure these sorts of things. And I'm going to end up doing that as part of this. So I'll talk about my process going through there. And then, Nate Tice, I don't know, the guy just shows up. Unfortunately for Nate, I don't agree with him a ton on a lot of different things. I don't agree with him, but I have different methodology, I guess. He has an Anthony Richardson article, and he's talking about completion percentage as part of it. And I wrote about Richardson in the lead up to the draft cycle. So I want to revisit that article that I had about Richardson and about completion percentage, and then also talk about some of the issues that he mentions with completion percentage, but then maybe, lean into the fact of, guess what? A lot of people have done a lot of work on these things that he's saying people need to kind of do work on. All right. So those are the topics, those two articles. And then we'll go into the Q&A after that. So let's first go to Arif Hassan. He has he's a brother in Substack. So he has Substack, the wide left dot football. He's got he's got the NFL at the end, and he's got the dot football in his Substack. So here's Arif on here. Very interesting picture. I don't know what's going on with the explosion in the background and the ski mask and the beanie and everything else there. But Arif, Vikings guy, presumably he's from that area. Let me see. Does it say on here? No, it doesn't say where he's living, but presumably he's from that area. Started off Vikings, did some national reporting, back to Vikings focused, I would say, a lot, but then also some political takes and some general cultural stuff at Wide Left. Had a huge article. He doesn't have it pinned. I was wondering if you have it pinned, but he got a ton of followers based upon. Well, let's go ahead and let's go bring up his Substack here. So you had a huge article. Actually, it doesn't have a like most popular. Oh, no, here we go. Most popular. Huge article, The Rise and Fall of Draft Network, where this got shared by a bunch of people. I think it even got shared by Rap Sheet at one point. I think I saw that being shared there, which was interesting. I mean, it's one of those things where it's a little salacious in a way, not salacious in any sort of, dirty or like pornographic sort of context, but more like thing blows up, people doing some unethical stuff, a lot of disgruntled former employees talking about the woman who was running it for a while. And so people love that sort of stuff. I mean, I, for one, I like Arif a lot, and I think he's one of the really good analysts out there. I probably don't do enough of a good job like highlighting the people I like as opposed to talking about the people who I disagree with, because of the fact that people I disagree with probably have the loudest voices. And when it comes to the NFL and general sports media, but this lane, which is interesting, this is like the most popular thing that Arif has done. Is probably actually not my sort of lane. I mean, I think it's interesting this thing blew up, but I think there's a lot of Schadenfreude sometimes when it comes to people reading this stuff and liking to see other people go down in a way. And then it's also getting retweeted by a bunch of people who used to work at Draft Network before it went down. So you should check that out if you're gonna subscribe to Arif in his Substack here. But the article that I will talk about, and this is what he reached out to me about, is he wrote an article called "Is Clutchness Real?" An overly long essay on the topic of clutch quarterbacks. I'm not going to go through his whole essay. He mentions that it's 10,000 words, and I love you, Arif, but he's like the opposite of me when it comes to writing. Like, I'm trying to grind out a couple thousand words, and mostly I'm just going to do some charts and be like, you guys figure it out. I'm not going to have a lot of flowery language around the whole thing and explain every detail, because I'm just lazy. But certain people like Arif probably goes like a little bit too long, and then could use some editing on the other side, which it's kind of interesting because it's very much on the opposite of me. But he wrote 10,000 words about this, and he spoke with myself. Who else did he talk to? Let's see. Chase Stewart, Football Perspective, and Timo Riske of Pro Football Focus. So all analysts who I like. Again, Chase Stewart's like one of the. He's not an old guy, but he's like a godfather-ish sort of person at Football Perspective. If anyone hasn't looked at Football Perspective, I'll bring that up right now so you can share. If anyone hasn't looked in here, it looks like it hasn't been a post since January 3rd of 2024. There was a while here, I don't know how long, at least a decade, I believe, where he was posting every single day something, just like a little nugget. It's pretty cool because he's not using any sort of super advanced programming or, tracking data or spatial whatever. He's just kind of like, let's look at some stats and a lot of historical stuff that he had. So awesome resource. And also points to the fact that, like me, honestly, you don't have to be the most sophisticated analyst to do this sort of work. But anyway, so back to the articles. What is clutchness? So Arif sent me, and I'm taking behind the curtain a little bit here. So he sent me a DM. Whoops, I gotta bring up my thing here. So he sent me a DM asking about it. And here were his questions when he was going to go into this topic. And this kind of gives you an idea of when my mind started working, and then probably spamming him with a whole bunch of data and charts and stuff based upon this. So he had 4 questions, a two-parter, or maybe a two-parter for question number 2. But his questions were, how would you define clutchness? It's actually a pretty interesting question. How would you define clutchness? Because it's used a lot. For some reason, it's the second time that I'm mentioning pornography in this in this live stream. Maybe I'll get some more views because of that. But it's like the definition, the Supreme Court definition. I don't even know what the case was of pornography, where it's like you know it when you see it. So it's kind of similar, I think, in clutchness. I probably should have used that when I was talking to Arif, but I did not mention that. There's some, I know it when you see itness about it. But when I tried to define it in a very nerdy sort of way, and Arif included this in the post here, I put a positive correlation between performance and I put efficiency or success rate. I'm actually going to use win probability added in this to put everything on the same scale. But so a positive correlation between performance, and again, I'm going to use win probability added, and win probability leverage on a play-by-play basis. Now, I define win probability leverage, and I'll tell you how I come up with this, but it's kind of like what's your expected win probability range of outcomes, and how big is it on an absolute value basis, right? So like if certain plays, let's say a 3rd down and 5 from the 5-yard line, whether or not you convert that makes a pretty big difference on your win probability for a game. Let's say it's near the end of the game also, versus 1st and 10 on your own 20-yard line to start that same drive. That particular play, not nearly as much win probability leverage on it. So how I came up with defining clearly win probability leverages, I just took some data from I just take random samples basically from a number of years of different plays. I only look at quarterback dropbacks. I mean, we could look at rushing plays too, but let's whatever. Quarterbacks are designed to drop back and pass, right? So I look at quarterback dropbacks and I say, let's look at time remaining in the game. Let's look at score differential. What else did I put into it? Let me give you the exact model formula that I came up with here. Okay. Yeah. Time remaining, down, yards to go, score differential, field position. And then I have as the dependent variable win probability added, but the absolute value of win probability added. So it's going to look at, if you lose 20% of win probability, or you gain 20% of win probability, those are both being viewed basically equally on this play. So you want to just get like the magnitude is what we're really talking about of the win probability added. I use the term leverage here because if you look at some really cool graphics that came out, I think Brian Burke might have been the first one who did it, and maybe Timo Risque or some other guys were doing it later, where they was looking at what they called playoff leverage. So it's before going into a particular game, you could see how important it was, the winner of different games on playoffs. So like the higher leverage, the more that particular game will affect playoff chances for certain teams. So this is kind of a similar concept, and I'm calling it win probability leverage. And in looking at this, I'm going to say, based upon those factors, those independent variables, the dependent variable, or the target variable in different parlance of modeling, is going to be the absolute value of win probability added. And then for every single play, pre-play, I'm going to have a definition of what is your kind of expected absolute value of win probability movement on that particular play. Okay, so that's how I'm defining like how important a play is. Now, there are additional factors when it comes to playoffs or not being the playoffs. Maybe even if you want to say Super Bowl or further into the playoffs versus earlier in the playoffs, although I think it's pretty binary between the playoffs. All playoff games are seen as being super ridiculously important. Not necessarily the Super Bowl versus the other, since so few teams actually get to the Super Bowl and quarterbacks have so few chances to make high leverage plays in the Super Bowl, but it's definitely on a different basis than the regular season. And looking at that measure, okay. Well, I'll just say also that my layman's term is playing better in the highest pressure impact situations. So, in other words, when I say there's a positive correlation, it means not only do you play well in in these high win probability leverage situations, but you play better in those situations relative to how you as a quarterback play in the lower probability situations. Um, I think that's fair to look at it that way because that shows that like you have a baseline level of performance for a quarterback, and then they're that much better when the stakes are higher on that particular play. Now, all this being said, there's a healthy dosage of luck and variance that goes into this because there's just so few plays that really hit that bar for being a high leverage sort of play. And Chase Stewart has a similar thing in here. Um, for Chase Stewart, his definition says, I think what people are trying to get at. So he's not talking about himself. He's more talking about what people are trying to get at. But anyway, with clutch is essentially a combination of two variables. When a situation is very high leverage, so he uses the same terminology as me, leverage. Alternatively defined as, say, third downs when there's a high expected swing and win probability before a play. Oh, so he's talking about exactly what my measure is. See, great minds think alike. Chase Stewart's using the same exact measure here. A quarterback plays better than he does in normal situations. So the exact same thing that I said. Now, I said it in a little bit more nerdy way, saying there's a positive correlation between the two. But exactly what I'm saying here. So what I want to do for you is once I had that definition, and I thought, well, let's do some testing. Like, let's figure out how quarterbacks look vis-a-vis this measure and how we can look at some of the results here and how they align at least partial, sometimes align perfectly, sometimes not align so perfectly with what our expectations would be based upon how different teams are known or not. So there's a bunch of different ways to look at this. When you look at plays that have a leverage of an absolute value of 5%, so it's almost like a 10% swing in either direction is your expectation on this, whether you convert or not. That comes out to about 10% of total plays. So I'm going to use that marker. So let's figure like in a big game, a quarterback would have 40 dropbacks, 40 to 50 dropbacks. So we're talking about 4 to 5 plays during each game on average, not for every game because certain games are going to have a lot more high leverage plays than other games. But about 4 to 5 plays on average that really drive the result. So that was what I was going to do as a cutoff. Initially, when I looked at this, I looked at the just straight correlations and kind of plotted it out and looked at some big quarterbacks. I looked at Lamar Jackson, Patrick Mahomes, Josh Allen, and Aaron Rodgers in particular, because I think they all have their own narratives around how well they play. And you, in fact, found that Patrick Mahomes had the highest correlation, if you're just going to plot those two things out, between win probability leverage and win probability added on an average basis. So how much he was actually adding on a play-by-play basis. He was the best. Allen was kind of next. Rodgers was a little bit next. And then Jackson was just not good overall in their careers. Now, like I mentioned before, the playoffs make a much, much bigger imprint on people's impressions of these quarterbacks. But of their overall careers, those were the numbers. Now, Jackson had some very, very, very high leverage plays where he had performed well, but those are kind of trumped by the larger volume of high but not super high leverage plays where he did not play well. And I think that kind of comports with what we think about what we've seen with Lamar Jackson. So when we look at the numbers, though, and I'm going to look at the numbers first, I'm just going to give you some numbers based upon the regular season. So I'm going to say, let's look at all the plays in the regular season where the leverage, the expected leverage is plus or minus 5%. So about 10% leverage of win probability on those plays. Let's compare that to all plays during the regular season, their win probability added. And I'm doing a minimum of 100 of what I call these clutch plays. And again, we're going to have, 4-ish sort of plays per game per quarterback on average here. So a lot of guys are gonna make this threshold, but you have to have played at least for probably a few years before you get on the radar here. And what I'm going to look at specifically is, in going by the definition of this clutch play. I mean, I think part of our impression of clutch guys is like you have to be good, not just relatively good. Like you can't be the worst quarterback in the NFL and then be average in the clutch and think that this guy is really clutch. I don't think that's how it works. But anyway, I'm just going to look straight up at the differential between these two numbers. So I get 135 different quarterbacks that have at least 100 clutch plays. So these 10% plus or minus 5% win probability plays here. And just to give an example of like the sample sizes for the biggest quarterbacks, Tom Brady has, and this is just in the regular season, has almost 1,500 of these dropbacks. Drew Brees has about 1,200. So does Ben Roethlisberger. So does Matt Ryan. Derek Carr has 1,100, which is interesting. That's a pretty high number for the fact that he hasn't been playing nearly as long. Phillip Rivers is more around 1,000. Eli Manning 1,000. Stafford 1,000. Aaron Rodgers 1,000. And then after that, we got Russell Wilson, Joe Flacco, Peyton Manning after that, and some others. Okay, so that's kind of some of the numbers that we're looking at here for these guys. So first, if we look at the differential between the two, so who has outperformed the most? I'm going to skip over some guys, although former PFF colleague Brad Gradkowski is actually number 1 on this list. But that's mostly because his win probability added on the non-clutch plays wasn't good. It was negative, but he was decently high on the clutch plays. So we're going to skip him, though, to go over some of these other guys. Next on the list, now only 274 clutch plays. So we're not talking about 5 times the amount or 4 or 5 times the amount when we talk about these other quarterbacks who have been around for a very long time. Joe Burrow. Interesting. So his average win probability added in these clutch plays in the regular season, again, this is all regular season stuff, is about 1.7% per play that he's adding. And again, when I was saying that these are high leverage situations, remember, they could be positive or negative, and this nets out some of that. You're not going to get a high number here. I mean, you're going to get a higher number here than you would on a normal play-by-play basis if you're good, or a lower number if you're bad because of the small sample size. But just because there's a high leverage on a play, the quarterbacks are going to combine positives and negatives in the average. So the averages aren't going to be, 5% plus on these sorts of plays. But 1.7% for Burrow in these 274 clutch plays. And then of his about 2,100, all of his plays during the regular season, all of his dropbacks is less than 0.5%. So his win probability added, there's 2 different ways to look at it. One is the differential. So it's about a 1.3% difference. But if you think about it another way, it's almost triple. You're almost tripling his actually, it's more than tripling. Sorry. It's more than tripling his win probability added. It's actually getting into the neighborhood of almost 4 times higher in these clutch plays for Joe Burrow than it is in his normal plays. And this is during the regular season. You also get some kind of funky results in some small sample thing. Again, we had Gradkowski as number 1, Christian Ponder, number 2. Again, poor overall win probability added, but over 1% average beyond that. Jeff Blake. Do you guys remember Jeff Blake? I remember Jeff Blake. I'm dating myself here, but there was a pretty funny instance of my college. This is when I was going to college. So I'm really dating myself because some of you guys are probably just like in college or just getting out of college now. When I was going to college, it was Jeff Blake, and who was the receiver? I want to say it was Blake. Was there a guy Pickens that used to play? Let me look this up. Sorry, this is, again, I'm going off on tangents. I apologize here. But it was like a couple of my roommates for fantasy football got, and let's look at Blake's good years here. So he had some solid years in 95 and 96. So let's look up 96. It was probably 96 that this happened. Where they were toasting each other because they're like Blake to, I want to say they said Pickens. Oh, it was Carl Pickens. I totally forget. So it's like Blake to Pickens. He had 174 targets that year. Lord, still didn't have that great of a year, though. Talking about inefficiency. Only 1,100 yards. 1,100 yards and 12 touchdowns is pretty good, but 174 targets. So they were toasting Blake to Pickens, and then, Blake's career fell apart after that. So also this clutchness thing can probably like fool people in small samples, right? Because these are the highest leverage plays. So it's kind of like how Carson Wentz was awesome on third down for his entire second year, and then he was an MVP candidate, and he was rated number 3 overall in the NFL 100, the listing that all the NFL players come up with. We got okey doked. We got fooled by his low sample, high leverage plays on there. So anyway, major tangent there. But anyway, Jeff Blake next, Drew Lock next. You get a lot of guys that probably don't belong here. But now we're starting to get into some higher samples. So Patrick Mahomes. And what's interesting about Patrick Mahomes on here is that while he may be 7th here in differential, and you know what? Let me up the amount here. Let's up it to like 200 minimum play, so we get some real guys in here. So while he may be 2nd in differential, he's coming off of like a very high baseline. If you take his win probability added on all plays, it's the highest. So he's also the 2nd highest amongst guys who at least have 200 clutch plays in the regular season. He's also the 2nd highest in differential. So it's like he's really, really good all the time, and then he's super ridiculously good on these clutch plays. Now, you guys might think the number 3 person on here is I've again, I'm juking the stats here to get this because of my ongoing promotional campaign here, disinformation campaign, some may say, of making people think Jimmy Garoppolo is good. But he's 3rd on the list for differential. And this is something that actually doesn't come as being unexpected for me, because I knew that he was always good on third down. And if you're good on third down, then that's interesting. And I used to always point that out because maybe Shanahan is just like a master strategist on third down, but I think it doesn't perfectly align with maybe what the narrative would be on Jimmy Garoppolo, which is you have this really strong running game, you do play action, and then he makes hay on the fact that teams think he's going to run. I mean, on third down, teams pretty much know you're passing unless it's 3rd and 2 or 3rd and 1. So the vast majority of the time on third down, on these high win probability leverage plays, teams know you're going to pass it. And I'll talk about that a little bit more. The next guy in win probability added, interesting, Vince Young. So that's an interesting one there. Aaron Brooks, old Saints quarterback, is next on there. Again, he's benefiting from just not being that good overall. Next is Aaron Rodgers. And I'm going to talk a lot about Rodgers later because he's not quite as good in the playoffs. And is that a small sample bad luck for Aaron Rodgers in the playoffs? Because over 1,000 of these quote unquote clutch plays during the regular season, dude's really good. I mean, he's really good overall, and he's really good on these clutch plays. So has he maybe gotten a little bit unlucky, or can we? I mean, I think this is like a big question when we talk about a lot of these narratives. Can we definitively say that like the most important play in every NFL game is pretty important, is pretty high impact, is pretty pressurized? Does the playoffs really come to that next level? So if someone underperforms in the playoffs, we could say that they're more affected by the pressure, where they weren't more affected by the high pressure plays in the regular season, but they are in the playoffs. I'm probably going to attribute that mostly to luck, but I think you can make an argument that they're on a different level. We have some other guys here, which are interesting. Teddy Bridgewater, Andrew Luck, Tua, which I probably wouldn't have expected, Gardner Minshew, Colin Kaepernick. So a bunch of different names here. Some big names that might be interesting to see, and again, I'm going to contrast this with the playoff results pretty soon, is Peyton Manning added about 0.52 win probability added per play during all of his plays in the regular season, which is the 2nd highest to 0.52%, which is the 2nd highest to Patrick Mahomes overall. He's still over 1% during the regular season on these clutch plays. So he was making these clutch plays during the regular season, the high impact plays. Playoffs will be a different story, and we'll talk about that and how that really feeds into maybe the unclutchedness of Peyton Manning versus some others. And then also a really interesting one is Tom Brady. So Tom Brady almost doubles his win probability added in these clutch plays. So it's good, but it's not as big of a mark as Drew Brees. It's not as big of a mark as Ben Roethlisberger. It's not as big of a mark as Peyton Manning or Aaron Rodgers or all this and that. And I think when it comes to Brady, and I know we have to segment out his career in different phases. So this is including the whole thing. So maybe like later career when he starts being like more of an MVP caliber player than early in his career where he was, above average quarterback, but not that sort of guy. maybe we have to segregate these things out to get a better impression of Brady. But I think a lot of the things you start to learn about Brady when it comes to his idea of being a clutch quarterback is, he lost a lot of Super Bowls too. They made it to the playoffs so many times. So it's really like Brady's dominance in a way was really just like in a consistency, and it's a weird way. It's not necessarily like Michael Jordan going to the NBA finals 6 times and winning all 6 of those NBA finals, which people might associate, Jordan with Brady. I mean, Brady lost a bunch of Super Bowls. Brady went to the playoffs as the number 1 seed on a dominant team lots of times where they didn't win the Super Bowl, whereas that never happened for Michael Jordan. When once the team was good enough to win, they ran off 3 straight. He left to go play baseball for 2 years. He came back mid-season and he wasn't quite there yet physically, I don't think, in that season. They lost in the playoffs, and then he ran off another 3 straight, right? It was almost like once he reached a certain point, he was unstoppable, which has something to do with the lower variance of the NBA game. But it's also very different from Brady, where Brady just like put himself in the position, and the team and the Patriots put themselves in the position to have a very high Super Bowl total, and get some great performances along the way, by being consistently so good for so long. Just a ridiculous amount of consistency and putting yourself in that position, more so than like having insane production when you were in that position. This also goes into my QB GOAT rankings, where Brady's playoff number doesn't look quite as great as you might think versus guys like Troy Aikman or Terry Bradshaw, or others that Bart Starr, others who like have multiple championships through just playing lights out during the playoffs and playoff runs, where that wasn't necessarily the case for Brady. So I think it's interesting that these numbers, even during the regular season, you say, just extremely solid, but maybe not great numbers for Brady. But then when we turn to looking at the playoffs, and again, I think this is when we're going to get the real metrics for what we're talking about. And what I'm going to look at specifically here is not playoff, not in a, I'm not going to do the same thing where it's the high leverage plays in the playoffs versus the regular plays in the playoffs. I'm going to look at the high leverage plays in the playoffs versus the high leverage plays in the regular season. So we can see, like, in the playoffs, how much did someone really perform differently? And I think this is going to give us an idea of maybe what some noise might be here, where in a very low sample, if they perform very well or poorly versus what they did in the regular season, a lot of people are probably going to attribute that to shrinking in the playoffs or stepping up in the playoffs, where the reality might be that it's just a low sample. Or, I mean, no matter what, it's a combination of those two things. It's just like, what degree are we combining them or not? So when you look at guys who have at least 10 clutch play opportunities, right, in the playoffs, which isn't a lot, but you don't get a lot of chances in the playoffs for a lot of guys. Actually, you know what? I'm going to move this number up just to make it easier. So let's look at 20. So you have to have 20, at least 20 clutch plays. Let's look at the win probability difference now. And again, this is comparing their high leverage plays, how good they were on those in the playoffs versus how good they were on those during the regular season. Okay? So Kurt Warner is number 1 as far as stepping up in the playoffs. So he was 3.55% win probability added per 39 clutch plays that he had in the playoffs. Over 374 clutch plays in the regular season. So almost 10 times the amount of sample. He had negative win probability added on those clutch plays. Guy's a Hall of Famer. And yeah, he won an MVP and he had a great year there, but he's a Hall of Famer somewhat because of maybe some of these clutch plays that he made in the playoffs when they made playoff runs. Not only the playoff runs he made with the Rams where they were really strong, but then of course, later on in his career, going to the Super Bowl with the Arizona Cardinals. So, I don't know. Like, is he clutch? He might be thought of as a clutch guy because of those 39 plays that he made an extremely high number during the playoffs, but during a much, much larger sample of the regular season, he didn't show up as being that clutch on these sorts of plays. Jake Delhomme, number 2, as far as stepping up his game in the playoffs versus the regular season, 3.3% on only 25 plays, 3.3% in the playoffs versus negative 0.3%. So kind of a bad number there. Remember Delhomme, they went to the Super Bowl, that team, probably because of these clutch plays. I'm sure there were like Jake Delhomme is clutch. Any of you Carolina fans from back in the day probably remember that. And again, we're talking about 25 plays in the playoffs here versus 428 plays in the regular season. I'm going to say he's probably not actually that clutch, and maybe just got lucky on some of these plays in the playoffs. Next, Mark Sanchez. People probably don't remember, unless you're an old like myself, some of the playoff runs that they had, trouncing the Patriots once in the playoffs, at least once. I think it was only once in the playoffs. Over 26 clutch plays that Sanchez had in the playoffs, 2.1%. Win probability average, positive 2.1%. Over the 371 clutch plays he had in the regular season, negative 0.8%. And that's just like a bad number. That's the third worst number of anyone here. So he was like the third worst quarterback in the regular season on these high leverage plays. And then he was the sixth best quarterback in the playoffs on these high leverage plays. That's where, if Mark Sanchez in another world like had a career-ending injury after some of those Jets years where they went on some playoff runs, people might still be like, oh, Jets fans might still say to themselves, man, if he only would have stayed healthy, we had a winner. We had a winner who could have taken us and we could have battled with the Patriots for a number of years. And I mean, the reality was he was getting lucky in the playoffs on his own plays, and then they had a great defense, which was probably going to fade anyway. Next on the top guys, Tony Romo. Now, I was surprised to see this because, of course, Romo is seen as being kind of like a playoff choker, famously not even winning at all for quite a long time in the playoffs here. Only 26 plays because he doesn't have the high volume because they didn't win many of these. But 2.72% on average on these clutch plays in the playoffs versus 0.82 in the regular season. So that's an awesome number for the regular season. That's like a really, really good number for the regular season. And he still was that much better. So Tony Romo, I'm always a Tony Romo apologist as far as how good the guy is. I mean, if the guy had a long enough career, I think he played like at a Hall of Fame almost sort of level. But of course he didn't. And they didn't win enough playoff games. Next, Pat Mahomes. So Pat Mahomes now is a little bit of a of an issue where he should be higher on this list. If you look at an absolute value, his clutch win probability added, it's only slightly behind Kurt Warner at 3.52% versus 3.55%. But Kurt Warner did it on 39 plays. Pat Mahomes has had 97 plays already. Rodgers has had 99 plays in his career. Roethlisberger, 93. So Pat Mahomes already has more plays because he has had so many plays that were high leverage dropbacks that he's made so far in his career, which is just crazy. I think it shows you a couple of different things. It shows you just how many games they've had already, right? Making it to the AFC Championship or further over and over again. And how many times the ball has been in his hands to make a play in a close game in these games. It's been through the roof. So the fact that he's done it over such a larger sample than these other guys, I think really puts him in another category as being like truly the best playoff performer, having done it for such a long period of time in these clutch plays. And his clutch plays during the regular season are 1.65%. So that's only a little bit behind Joe Burrow on this number. It's kind of weird that he's behind Joe Burrow, but he has, twice as many plays. So that has something to do with it too. So he comes from the third highest number of anyone on this list during the regular season. And then he's second highest in the playoffs, but there's a huge step up here for Pat Mahomes. So again, just adding to the Pat Mahomes legend when it comes to these things. Blake Bortles is next. Remember, Bortles had that run where they probably should have beaten the Patriots if it wasn't for some interesting calls. Blake Bortles stepped up a lot in the playoffs, but the reality here is that he was just really, really bad. He was the worst during the regular season, losing over 1% on these clutch plays. And then he was positive 0.74% during the playoffs. So he stepped up a lot, stepped up, put that in quotes, stepped up a lot, but, it's coming off of a poor baseline. Matthew Stafford has been better in the playoffs. That explains somewhat of their Super Bowl run. Brett Favre, a lot better in the playoffs. And I think this is interesting. We're going to compare Brett Favre in a second to Aaron Rodgers and maybe some feelings about them is that, Favre actually wasn't fantastically great during the regular season on these clutch plays, but 1.22% during the playoffs on 45 plays. So not that many plays either. You might think there'd be more plays. Phillip Rivers, and that's another one, which is shocking because of his lack of playoff success. He was actually not so good on clutch plays during the regular season, but he was pretty good during the playoffs, but they still couldn't find success, gave up a ton of points. Man, that defense was bad during there. But as we go a bit further, it's interesting again, like Tom Brady stepped up somewhat, but not tremendously, but he didn't blow it, He didn't blow it in the playoffs, unlike Peyton Manning. And let's get to Manning here. So as far as differential of these 36 quarterbacks who had at least 20 clutch plays in the playoffs, differential, Peyton Manning is the, let me see, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, is the 8th worst. So he had over 1% clutch plays during the regular season. He was adding win probability added. He was negative over 115 plays, so a decent sample during the playoffs. So what do we think about that? I don't know. I mean, 115 plays is a good enough of a sample where I'm not going to write it all off as noise. There are obviously weather issues, having to step outside of the dome, go on the road, go to New England a bunch of times, which hurt him there. So there might be a little bit of a combination of Peyton Manning just like not being built for playoff football and going on the road and things like that, and that affecting that number. But I do think there's also probably a lot of noise in here because he did step up in the clutch during the regular season. Other names of note that fall in here. What's interesting about Joe Burrow is I think Joe Burrow probably has a impression as being a clutch playoff performer because they went all the way to the Super Bowl, then they beat the Bills the next year in Buffalo. The reality is he's been bad on clutch plays in the playoffs. He's been really, really good during the regular season. He's actually lowest as far as the differential between those two. There's a 2.5% lower win probability added when it comes to the playoffs. And I think that just shows you that he had some really bad performances where the team was still able to win. Like he had bad performances during clutch plays where, McPherson, their kicker, was on fire and their defense was on fire a couple of different years. So that's like a little bit head scratching to see that. Jimmy Garoppolo is another one where he has bad performance, but only 25 dropbacks during the playoffs versus really good performance during the regular season. And Lamar Jackson has like really, really, really bad performance and only 20 plays. So he doesn't have many plays. So a lack of playoff games, but also, maybe he wasn't dropping back to pass as often as he could have been in some of these situations, but really bad performance, losing about 1.5% on clutch plays during the playoffs, which is the second worst number of anyone on here. The only person who's worse who has at least 20 clutch plays is Rex Grossman. So we got Lamar Jackson in the Rex Grossman territory here for the playoffs. But also during the regular season, he hasn't been great. He's basically been flat during the regular season when it comes to his clutch performance. So that leads into maybe another discussion here. Sorry, I hit the old cough button there. This leads into another discussion here of like, what is clutch? Like, what's driving this clutch performance? And like, why? That was another thing that Arif was talking about, asking me there. And I think when it comes down to it, because we're talking about, if we're going to define it as the high leverage plays, these high leverage plays are third down or fourth down. They mostly know you're going to pass already. They can be from longer distances. It's really a situation where the defense knows what you're going to do. So the people who I believe are able to outperform in those situations are people who really are either able to overcome difficulties in these situations. So like the defense is going to call the right defense a certain percentage of the time to stop what you've done, and you still have to make a play somehow. Guys who can do that. So it's guys who can execute when it is available, and it's guys who can overcome a poor contextual situation and still execute. So that's like what I would say for the Patrick Mahomeses of the world, right? That's what I would say for other guys during the regular season, at least, for the Aaron Rodgers of the world. Joe Burrows of the world when it comes to the regular season. Again, his playoff number has been good, but the regular season of the world. The Josh Allens of the world. And maybe for Lamar Jackson, again, And Lamar Jackson has always been a really interesting like topic for me because um there's so much behind taking an objective statistical stance on Lamar Jackson. So many people have put their flag up and have projected onto Lamar Jackson their feelings about lots of different topics, whether it's, cultural sorts of things and other things where I think they do a disservice to Jackson himself doing that. I think they do a disservice to trusting their own analysis when you do that too much. Where depending upon how and when I'm looking at Lamar Jackson, I could sometimes be a defender of his and I could sometimes be a critic of his versus what the prevailing opinion is in different groups. There are some groups of people who just want to be a defender of his at all times. There are some groups of people who want to be a critic of his at all times. And I think there's not good analysis to do that. Um, but the numbers do play out, and we'll see if this changes going forward. Because I know Jackson was throwing a bit more in some different concepts that may open up the offense and what its ability to do in these like obvious pass situations a little bit more. But he hasn't performed well. Like the knock on him, even from the haters, even from the people who you're not supposed to ever agree with, or certain people think you're not supposed to ever agree with, guess what? Haters are right sometimes. You can't just say the haters say the sky is blue. You can't be like, nope, I can't. I won't participate in sky is blue discourse because the haters are saying it. Don't let your critics define your own opinions. Okay. Or people that you feel like are not part of your tribe or whatever. Define what your own opinions are. So the thing with Jackson is a lot more effective than people want to give him credit for, a lot better passer than people want to give him credit for. But still, we have seen not only in the playoffs, but in the regular season, not to the same degree as in the playoffs when he's failed, but in the regular season that in these quote unquote clutch situations where they kind of know you're going to pass the ball and you got to make a play, he's been less able to do that so far in his career. Now you could say, oh, he's a bad receiver, whatever you want to say. There's probably part of it, but I don't think it's I think there's something to Jackson himself than an Allen or a Mahomes or otherwise. Like there are fewer outs. He presents you with the skill set and ability, at least so far in his career, with fewer outs as far as making plays in those situations. And that's what we've seen through that numbers. And I think that's like how I would define clutchness in a way, is having that ability. But at the same point in time, and maybe I'm getting a little too meta here, when we're thinking about this, like if you're saying someone has certain abilities and that's what makes them clutch, then that kind of isn't really stepping into what the actual clutchness is supposed to be measuring is, which is some sort of internal mechanism to step up in the biggest moments that maybe should be separate from what your abilities allow you to do. It's like so it all gets into this messiness when we're defining something like clutchness. But whatever it is, Lamar Jackson, at least so far in his career, doesn't seem to have it. Which is interesting. And one of the last questions that Arif mentions on here is like, how did the media handle it? And whatever, the media is just like, there's always going to be a lot of narratives. People are always going to pick out the stats that they think backs what they already have to say. People are going to lean too hard. I think that's generally like my normal stance when it comes to media, is they lean too hard into either someone being clutch, like even Mahomes after this last championship. I had some issue with some stats being shared about him and his relative clutchness on these final drives versus other Hall of Fame quarterbacks. It was being overstated. It was like a bad split. It was unfair, really, to the other quarterbacks. They were including a bunch of drives where they had like 2 seconds. Like, what are they going to do with 2 seconds at the end of a game? Even if I know Mahomes did score with 15 seconds once, that's fine. But, how many times are these other guys going to be able to score with even fewer seconds left on the clock? So even that's going to happen sometimes, and it's going to be overstated in the other direction of someone failing in the clutch. So I think that would be my general take. But of course, this is like no one is incentivized in media to have a more measured, more towards the middle take on these sorts of things. So again, I'm not, don't hate the player, hate the game, I guess, when it comes to some of these things. All right, but that's my general. That's how I would look at it. That's how I would look at it. If people are interested in kind of my methodology and my thinking about the clutch in that sort of way, if you have any more questions, let me know. You know what? I'm going to skip the Richardson Nate Tice thing because I don't know, whatever. I don't know. His completion percentage. We'll see if it turns around or not. I'm gonna get to some comments here and then buzz out of here to see if there's any more questions. If you have any questions, drop them in here, or shoot them to me, unexpectedpts@gmail.com, or on Twitter, and I'll get them in the next episode. All right, let's get some comments on here. Is right tackle actually less valuable than a left tackle? Is this just something that teams have fed into for years, or maybe it's self-fulfilling where the best tackles choose to play left early on? I mean, I think physically, well, it's difficult to measure. Protecting someone's blind side, which probably become less important as quarterbacks have become mobile and move around a lot, but protecting someone's blind side probably is more important. Like there probably is a peripheral vision sort of issue, especially wearing a helmet, where quarterbacks can't see as much what's coming from one side, which means not only are they less likely to avoid a sack from that side, although it seemed like guys, like Tony Romo in particular, had like eyes in the back of his head where he would do that duck down move, where someone thinks that they had him, dead to rights there. There's probably something where if that pressure, which is harmful on performance, leads to sacks and it leads to strip sacks in particular. I mean, think about the strip sack thing. Like how often do you see a guy strip the ball from the front side? It definitely happens, right? They rake down with two hands in the middle. But often it's like when the arm is back and about to throw, which is later on in the process, guys are getting more strips on those sort of situations, I think, from the backside. And of course, adding a fumble to the sack is like massively valuable. So there probably is something because most quarterbacks are right-handed. I guess that's the other part that kind of goes without saying, right? So most quarterbacks are right-handed, so then the left tackle is on their blind side. So I would say there is something to that. Now, because of that, that notion was probably overthought, though, the value of that. It didn't help that, Michael Lewis wrote the book, Blindside, and everything else that came into it. Probably didn't help, although I think it was accepted wisdom, football wisdom anyway, that in every program in America, from high school forward, your best pass blocker, well, you're making that person the left tackle. And when we look at anything, if you look at any like distribution of talent, it's weird. It's not intuitive, but it's true that when you look at the distribution of talent, like the middle guys, the rank ordering of value for guys who are in the middle is very tiny. It doesn't really, it's like, are you the 12th or the 13th best tackle? Whatever, that's fine. But once you get the difference between first and second is actually the biggest according to the distribution. You would think when you got into the elite of the elite talent that the differentials would be smaller because it's like, oh, these guys are all awesome, right? So what's the difference? But no, it actually ends up being like LeBron James versus the second best player in the NBA is a huge difference versus the 50th best player and the 51st best player in the NBA. Same thing, like Pat Mahomes is a huge difference to Josh Allen, even though Josh Allen is awesome in the NFL. So if you have every single team that is using this, that is putting their number one versus their number two guy, that's actually a really big difference in value, in the value differential between left tackles and right tackles institutionally built into every single program. It's probably based on a true notion that you should have the left tackle there. But it's reinforced over and over and over again. And then, the better players, when they want to play left tackle in the NFL, because in the NFL, this is another reinforcing like feedback loop type of situation. In the NFL, a lot of when you're negotiating for contracts is you're looking at comps, you're looking at comparable players. Well, you best believe if you're a right tackle, even a good right tackle, and this Lane Johnson was the first one to break through on this, I would say, for the Philadelphia Eagles. You better believe the team's coming to you with a list of right tackle salaries, not left tackle salaries. And they're saying, here are your comps. This is what we're willing to pay you, the top number of these comps. And you're thinking to yourself, wait, that number sucks. Remember, why am I forgetting his name right now? The tackle that went from the Chiefs Bengals trade tackle. Why am I forgetting his name right now? Orlando Brown. Remember Orlando Brown? One of the reasons he wanted to leave is he wanted to be a left tackle. Oh, no, actually, I guess it was when he went to the Chiefs from the Ravens. One of the reasons that he left is he wanted to be a left tackle. probably because of these reasons that we're talking about here of being in that elite sort of number. So there's reality to it. There's reinforced and exacerbated differentials because of the feedback loop to it. Um, and there's a self-fulfilling aspect. So they all come into play. Now with Penei Sewell getting this decent contract, they probably would have had to pay him more money if he was a left tackle, quite honestly. So I think the smart take is that the differentials between right and left tackle are smaller than common perception. Not as much as it used to be. There used to be like a real big difference between the actual value differentials and perception differentials. The perception has narrowed somewhat. Again, post Lane Johnson and others. Because even Mitchell Schwartz, I remember Mitchell Schwartz is a really good right tackle. He did not make that much money. The Browns chose to let him go in free agency and get a comp pick for him rather than sign him to a fairly modest contract. So I still think the differentials are probably lower than what people think, but it's gotten a lot more efficient, those markets. Are there specific exposure or thresholds to determine credibility for gamblers, broadcasters, and content to distinguish professionals and knowledgeable fans not, including players, coaches, and GMs? No, I don't think there is any specific exposure or threshold to determine credibility. Again, this is like the third time I'll mention, you know it when you see it sort of situation. I mean, I was just gonna say I don't care about things like a gambler's record or something like that. It's not that I don't care. It's just number one, how do you verify it? Number two, it's non-stationarity, right? Like if someone was really good in their gambling picks 5 years ago, and then that doesn't mean that they're good today. And when you're mashing all that in together, what does it mean? I think generally I'd rather just listen to someone talk about their process and figure out whether I believe in that thought process. More, that would be like the table stakes. That was something that I need, like a requirement that I would need before then thinking about digging into their records and things like that a little bit more as to whether or not to believe them. And that's when it comes to broadcasters and gamblers and others too. Just listen to what they're saying and whether or not I think it's a smart, thoughtful way of thinking about it, and don't just dismiss things that you may disagree with. I mean, if I've thought about it a ton and I disagree, then I might kind of dismiss it and just say, okay, I don't know about this guy. But don't make too quick of an impression, and also don't base everything on Twitter, because people are kind of dumb on Twitter. Even if they're not, even if they're smart, they're dumb on Twitter. Who would you say your top 5 analytically sound and bottom 5 analytically stunted coaches? I don't know. That's it. I got to skip that one. I'm sorry. I know we talked about front offices. You can look at an old episode I did with Ben Baldwin on that if you want to. This is a big question there. It's really hard because we just don't see a lot of what coaches do. So if I was going to give you like 4th down, go for it rates and things like that, that's just such a small part of what coaches are doing. Some of it is going to be talking the talk, but then you also don't want to get in a Brandon Staley situation where guys are talking the talk, but they're also talking the talk in a way where there's not a lot of substance behind what they're saying. They're kind of just like, we got to be aggressive. We got to believe in this, believe in that. And then you realize, oh, they were just vibing out the whole time. Q&A. Hi, Kevin. Do we understand yet the competitive difference between high-end billionaire owners coming into the league like David Tepper versus the old blood billionaires like the McCaskey fam? Yeah, it's funny. I was having last night, I was at a local soccer match. Shout out to the Maryland Bobcats. Division 3-ish. I guess there's actually is a football pyramid, believe it or a soccer pyramid, believe it or not, in America, but there's no relegation or promotion. So NISA is the name of their league, the NISA. 12 teams in there. It's the only local team from here. It's about 15-20 minutes away. They play at this place called the Soccerplex, which is fucking fantastic. Like these fields they have there all over the place. Not a lot of fans, but I enjoy going there. It's a good price point when I bring my 8-year-old also, because let me tell you, I'm not spending big money on 8-year-olds at soccer matches. But we did go to a Spirit match actually, which was excellent last Saturday. I'm going to a lot of soccer matches basically. But anyway, I'm tangent master is going off again here. Sorry. So I was talking to a Bengals fan, And it's like a dad of a classmate of my son's. He was not lamenting, but he was commenting on kind of this unfair impression of the Bengals ownership making bad moves because they're so cheap. And he was contrasting it to someone like the Steelers, who also, are kind of on the cheap side, and how they don't get a lot of guff. I'm assuming that a lot of this has to do with like the lead up to the Burrow negotiations and now the T. Higgins stuff and this and that. But it got into an idea of, yeah, there is really a competitive advantage for wealth. Now, we talk about new versus old billionaires. I guess technically you can say these guys who have owned teams like your Mark Davises of the world, who really don't have much as far as net worth, and really don't have much as far as liquid net worth outside of the football franchises. I guess technically they're billionaires, but the real difference is, what do you have as far as your liquidity? What other resources do you have that you can draw from? What sort of other collateral do you have, maybe to get loans at good rates and have cash flows coming in other areas that you can easily pay back whatever your interest is on these sorts of loans. Um, and that's what's going to make the big difference. And there is a competitive advantage, because it's not only the ability to just like re-sign players, it's to use the time value of money to fit more cash in and more players in under the salary cap. And let me explain this a little bit, because it's maybe not the most intuitive thing, but I think people will be able to grasp what I'm saying here. So if I'm talking to an NFL football player, and remember, the teams like the Bengals and the Steelers, and I think the Tampa Bay Bucks back in the day, although the Glazers have decent money now, so maybe this is even, I don't know if the Glazers are just cheap or what was going on. But they would do these kind of pay as you go type of contracts. So you're not paying as much of a signing bonus. There's not the dead money to cut eventually, and you're just shelling it out over a number of years. Now, the big lever here is we're talking about the bonus structure, mostly signing bonus. Now there are all these weird, funky bonuses that people are doing nowadays, and void years and everything else. Let's not overcomplicate things. Let's just talk about pure signing bonus, right? So for a pure signing bonus, you're paying it out today. You're amortizing the amount over the length of the contract up to 5 years. You can't go past 5 years. How long you're amortizing this amount out when it comes to what is being charged against the cap. So if you're in negotiations with a player, and let's say one negotiation is going on between David Tepper or the Waltons, who are like the Walton affiliated clan that's now taken over the Denver Broncos, who are, these are like god tier rich people who are now taking over NFL teams, versus your, Paul Browns or whatever Brown is, it owns the Bengals now, and your Mark Davises of the world. If you're going to say to a player, you know what, we'll give you, if you're Tepper, let's say, you say, you know what, we'll give you $100 million. I'm using big amounts here. We'll give you $100 million signing bonus, right? And then for the equivalent contract that the Bengals are offering someone, they'll say, well, we'll pay you an extra $20 million a year over the next 5 years. Technically, that's the same amount of money. And technically, the way that it would work against the cap would be the same, right? Because you'd amortize that 100 million out over the next 5 years. Well, guess what? The player is going to say, give me the 100 million today. Why in God's name would I take 20 million over 5 years? Why would I be getting $20 million 5 years from now, where I could have already had that $20 million 5 years earlier and have been investing that in something else? I mean, even if I took it and I just rolled it into some freaking treasury bonds for the next 5 years, I'd make 5% on it or whatever. I'm out of the market. I don't know what they're paying more now. I know inflation's high. So, I'm making like certain percent, and I'd have more money 5 years from now than I would. I mean, maybe I'd lose the money in the market, but you know what I mean? Maybe I'd be investing in NFTs. Who knows what would be going on, but I'd rather have that money today. It's easy. Time value of money. You rather so that's a negotiating advantage. And now you start to get into the fact where if you're the rich owner, you might be able to say to someone, you know what? Rather than giving you 20 million a year over the next 5 years, I'm not going to give you 100 million. I'll give you 90 million today. And someone might say, you know what? Figure everything. Okay, I'll take the 90 million today instead of more money over the life of the contract. Well, now you're actually having a lower cap hit versus what you would have done. You're making it. You're making the contract more palatable, more attractive to the player and getting a lower cap hit out of it. And that's what all these teams are doing, where they're able to float all that money up front. But you got to have the liquidity to give the money on day one. Now you're losing money because you would have had that money instead. And, guarantees go into it. You have to put it into escrow, all these sorts of things. So you're losing money because you're not investing it. But if you're richer than God, like who cares, right? If you're losing a little bit of money, if you're able to fit more players under the salary cap, the percentage of the salary cap is how you're valuing these contracts, and you're able to fit more and more players under that by giving them more money up front. Now you're taking more risk on the back end, but if you're willing to eat dead money, and a lot of these owners are willing to eat huge amounts of dead money now, really starting with the Carson Wentz contract. And of course, Jeff Lurie is a very rich individual for the Philadelphia Eagles. And then it's continued on further and further. I mean, I think the Broncos, again, very, very, very rich owners. And that's why they're able to eat all that dead money for the Russell Wilson contract. Yeah, it starts to give you a competitive advantage. And we're going to start to see that more and more, I think, as time goes on. Teams are willing to use these void years. Teams are willing to do all these weird roster and signing bonuses. That there is going to be a competitive advantage. Now, with the franchise tag, with all the money that's coming in from TV revenues, with the general equity within the NFL, it's not as big of a deal, but it will be interesting to see if any of these guys decide to sell out to the billionaire class, and how that when you have like really top tier wealthy individuals coming into the NFL, if that exacerbates that difference anymore. Another Q&A here. What do you think of the long-term viability is for a fun summer league where the NFL can experiment with rule changes? Worth it or not? I mean, probably not. I mean, the NFL is doing pretty hot right now. I think it should be more willing to maybe experiment with some rule changes, but you don't need to, honestly. I think it is interesting with these other leagues that are propping up, and I see people talking about them. I don't think it'll ever be much of a thing. College football is, of course, a place where you can do some experimentation, which I think is interesting, and we'll see if that ends up happening as we get more and more money into college football. If there's a little bit less friction to be making some changes there, and I think that could be interesting. Sorry, I did the old cough button again. I didn't bring anything to drink during this. That was a big error on my part. One change about how the league is run, what would it be? That's a good question. I mean, I can't come up with like exactly what my one change would be to how the league is run. I mean, I think as an easy thing, well, I don't know. Actually, I was like just something that just popped on the top of my head. I mean, the comp pick thing is like reinforcing. It goes against the whole theory of competitive balance. So, I might just get rid of the whole comp thing. Okay, here's an interesting thing. I think the Rams recently said something like, "We beefed up the O-line because defenses are getting so light. Is there a feasible point where running the ball becomes efficient enough to rival the pass?" Well, I mean, we're getting closer and closer in that direction, but probably not, just because there is a psychological fixation on like success rate, and I think some of it is reasonable. Like you'd rather be successful on a play in play out basis at a lower efficiency if you can do that at a very, very high success rate. But as long as there's that focus on success rate versus efficiency, and this is like the whole 2-pointer versus 3-pointer thing, you're probably always going to err on the side of success rate versus efficiency. So I don't think we'll get there, but it's possible. I think it's just like closer. We're just getting closer. Everyone thinks we're going to have some cyclical nature of the NFL where you go, oh, pass is more efficient. Now run, people should be running more. Now players should be getting bigger. No, we're kind of just moving in one direction, and then it's just going to stop. I don't think it's going to float back in any. We're going to press up against something eventually, but I don't think it's going to float back in any sort of direction. Q&A. Josh Allen had a higher PFF grade, EPA, and QBR than Mahomes this year, and yet most view Mahomes as a good deal ahead of him. Is it simply due to Mahomes having greater playoff success, or why? I mean, I think it's a larger sample, right? So Mahomes, like, for instance, if I was going to have my numbers, whether it's looking at PFF grades or EPA, and I'm going to forecast them going forward, even if Allen was better by those numbers this last season, and I think he was, over the larger sample of the regular season, Mahomes just went nuclear in the playoffs again. But we're still talking about, 2018, 2019, 2020, 2021, 2022. I mean, those seasons of Mahomes' excellent performance exist. And Allen's been really, really good since 2020. So even if you don't consider what he did and you assume he had some sort of like paradigm shift of his performance from 2020 on, still Mahomes is at another level. So I think there's enough to say, well, Mahomes probably had, some issues with the supporting cast and other things going on where he'd still be the guy that I project to being as good going forward. But to be quite honest, Josh Allen was like my clear number 2 guy. So I think it's like I'm high on Josh Allen probably versus the crowd in some different ways. But no, Mahomes is unimpeachable at this point. We'll see what happens after another season. Where is Russell Wilson in terms of clutch differential? I feel like he was always a slow starter, but then would catch fire in the 4th. Let me look that up for you. So when we come to the last number that I did, let's look this up. The last number that I did, which was comparing playoffs to regular season, he was okay on both. He was a little bit better in the playoffs. 83 clutch plays in the playoffs. I mean, clutch opportunities. So that's a big number. So he was 0.4% in the playoffs, which is okay, and he was 0.25% in the regular season, which again is okay. It's like not particularly great in either metric. Now, when I'm just looking at the regular season versus his, and he was 0.28 overall. So he actually was a little bit worse on clutch plays in the regular season than he was overall, but a little bit better in the playoffs on clutch plays than clutch opportunities than he was in the regular season. So, I don't think that surprises me. I mean, he's a quarterback who can make things happen with scrambling, but at the same point in time, I don't think he has the full array of at least quick game sorts of things that you would want to have to like beat any sort of defense in these third down, you're going to pass it situation. I do think he genuinely benefits, maybe even more so than someone like Jimmy Garoppolo, who they were saying for Garoppolo, who does have that quick game, but doesn't have the scrambling. I think he genuinely benefited from the kind of play action sort of guessing game for the defense a little bit more than some other quarterbacks, but not that much. I mean, he's still extremely solid quarterback under all situations, so he's not particularly dependent. At least the numbers don't say he has been, as they have said for someone like Lamar Jackson on a lower sample. So we'll see a little bit more with Lamar Jackson. All right, we got an hour and 15 almost in here, so I think I'm going to wrap it up. I hope people are appreciating these summer live streams where we can talk about some of this stuff, continuing them. Hopefully, we'll be able to continue this during the season, but obviously we got a ton of content coming up in the near future leading into the season, and the advanced reviews on every single game and all the quarterback rankings and all the projections and everything else. So stay tuned for all that. Have a great summer. Enjoy it. I'm enjoying the pool myself, the local pool and rec club, some soccer matches. Enjoy your time now before we get back into the grind in the fall. But until next week, I'll be talking to everyone later.